Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Shawn Deggans, owner of Green Nanny. Thank you very much for joining me today, Shawn.
Thanks for having me, David.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. Also, make sure to subscribe to our daily newsletter so you get it delivered to your inbox first. Shawn, I always like to start with a little bit of background. So how did you find yourself in the cannabis industry?
Well, I really got here through my wife. So my wife has been, actively basically involved in cannabis for a number of years. Her deceased husband basically was a grower, and her cousin is also a grower in Oklahoma who I work with on a regular basis. I've been a technology guy for about 25 years. And when my wife and I married, and I kind of got introduced into this world and saw all the medical benefits and how amazing it was, I started working with a cultivator in Oklahoma, Clint Baker, from Papa Jesus Farms. And since then, we've kind of off and on taken on projects. But since September, I've dived in headfirst and made Green Nanny like my big priority on building a consulting company that can help small, medium-sized growers, make the most out of technology, and that's where I'm at today.
Okay. Is your wife a grower?
She is a grower of perfectly legal things because we live in Texas. So
Understood. Okay. Still has a green thumb though.
Yeah, she's a gardener. We have tomatoes and squash and peppers, and we, have our own garden in the back and grow our own food and our own aquaponics system. So we're definitely involved in growing, just not cannabis.
Understood. So you said you started Green Nanny in September?
So, yes, we started Green Nanny actually in 2019, and it was with the original goal of really building IoT devices specifically for the cannabis industry. But a number of learning curves along the way kind of showed me that, well, my initial idea around it was probably not the best, as normally happens with a startup. But I was also working as a full-time consultant with a firm at the time as a technology consultant. It was in September that I basically put in my resignation, said, "Hey, I'm going to go do my own thing." And so since September, Green Nanny's been pretty much a majority of my focus. Okay. So that's where I'm at now. I'm trying to make it a full-time gig if possible.
What was the initial idea?
So the initial idea was to, in the name Green Nanny, is a nanny goat, is kind of our logo, but the idea was to put enough monitoring and systems and sensors in place around a plant that the plant would almost be alive and be able to kind of talk to you and tell you like what its health conditions were and its soil level, what was going on at the root zone, and a lot of those kind of things. And what I came to find out is like, no one really wants to replace the grower, right? Like growers need tools to help them. They're not looking for something to stay out of the garden, right? So it was this kind of transition of saying, okay, we have this idea and it's not a bad idea, but no one that I know of really wants a fully automated garden. Okay. That's not typically, when I talk to growers, it's many are even sort of technology adverse, but it's more of the situation of like, hey, give me things that are going to help me do my job, help me detect things, ahead of time, not necessarily try to replace me because I don't need to be replaced. And so that was sort of the transition, was the realization of that this isn't just a technical issue, it's also a people issue. And so some of my growth, in understanding that was from going from we'll just create a device, I'll do everything for you, to, hey, let's create devices that actually help the grower spend more time in the garden, because that's really where they like to be and where they want to spend their time.
So how has Green Nanny evolved to help cultivators spend more time with plants and less time on the technology?
Well, so recently, a big effort that we've been working on is this concept of the plant health pillars, and as well as like a maturity model around plant care. Now, I know that a lot of growers have an opinionated approach to growing, their stock, their cultivation, their cultivars. So I didn't want to basically step on anybody's toes in that way, but there are definitely some best practices that you can bring to growing and the technology around growing. And so what I have seen is a bit of a disconnect between growers and, well, what is the right technology to use? What's the right, thing to jump into? And so I developed this maturity model as a way to help cultivators kind of assess where they are, in a spectrum of different levels, all the way from ad hoc, meaning like we don't use technology, we don't really communicate data, we just walk in, we look at the plants, and we make decisions on the moment, to a sort of fully automated where it's like, yes, we're still involved in the plants, but watering is done automatically. We're using sensors in place to help adjust the temperature. We're looking for microclimates, which is a much more advanced level of technology. Now, David, in my experience as a consultant and a technology consultant, one of the things that kind of always upset me was when you would have a vendor, like let's say a large technology vendor, says, "Hey, here's the perfect solution for like every one of your clients," and it's typically some large, expensive setup that really requires like an advanced level of knowledge from your staff. It requires a large investment. And that may be the right solution for some cultivators, but for a lot of cultivators who may just be working off of clipboards and whiteboards to like message and keep track of where they're at on their harvest and to communicate with employees, jumping to something like that is almost destined to fail. Right. So what I've done is kind of given you that stepping ladder up on the maturity level, so you can say, well, I'm right here. I'm at like, the developing stage, but I'd like to get to the advanced stage. And so now we have a pathway to kind of get you there that looks at people, processes, and the tools and technology that they'll use. A big goal of mine has been, let's put people first. Like that's the to me the important part of the cultivation process is the people have to come first, and the technology can't get in their way. It needs to be part of the process of helping them achieve what they're trying to achieve.
Is the platform you're talking about Boutique Notion, and how has technology been getting in the way thus far?
So Boutique Notion is a smaller product that we put together to basically help those people who are like at that stage 1 or stage 2.
Okay.
And it's not meant to replace like a larger ERP like Cannabis 365 or something like that. It's really, boutiques in the name because it's meant for like a smaller grower, right?
Okay.
And I would say like technology, and I don't mean necessarily gets in the way, but there's a lot of overhead, as everyone kind of knows who's working in this field right now, especially when it comes to seed to sale tracking and everything that's basically involved in staying compliant and legal. Even to the point of like, some states require that you actually fill out forms and have those forms available, and if you're capturing that data already inside Metric or, BioTrack or one of those products, then why do you need to go and fill out a form? So finding a way of marrying that and saying, hey, all right, we'll run reports, or we'll find a partner who will help you run reports that are just going to print off these things for you so that you can hand them over to OMA or whatever your local compliance office is at your state. So that's just a small example. The other one is also, if you start looking at some gardens, I've seen gardens that are like oversaturated with telemetry devices and sensors, and they kind of get in the way. If every plant has a moisture sensor inside of it and you have 1,000 plants, you suddenly have wires all over your grow room. So finding ways of getting away from those types of issues is a point of focus for me, and making the best use of the technology that you buy. Sometimes people go out and they'll spend a whole lot of money on the technology without a real understanding of like, how can we exploit this and get the absolute most out of it? Like, how do we get the data out of it? How do we start making decisions off the data that we're gathering off of this very expensive system that we put in place? So it's in a way, it's not that it's necessarily the technology is in their way. It's just we can help make their use of technology more efficient by just looking at like, hey, what's your work process? What are you doing every day? What things are bottlenecking you? Like, what slows you down the most? And in those simple questions, we can go back and say, okay, well, if we put this product in place or this tool in place, train your people on it, get used to using it, because practice is part of the process. Then it will save you time and money in the long run.
I understand that growers are tech averse, but is there a happy medium?
That is, and David, I think there is, but I think that is different for every grower. And so part of the reason why I put together the maturity model was so that, and I try to make it very clear that, hey, look, if you're coming in on a 1 or a 2 on the maturity model, like, that's not a judgment. That may be what's working for you. And so I don't want to go in and fix things that like are, like aren't broken, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea would be that, and this is where, and I know consultants typically kind of have a bad name in all industries. It's not just cannabis, but it's kind of like lawyers and consultants. There's tons of jokes about us. But the truth is that having someone who can kind of come in and help you assess where you are in comparison to where other cultivators may be in the industry helps you to make the right kind of decisions for your organization. Because a lot of boutique growers, they're not necessarily looking to be a multi-state operator and build up, and they're not looking at that side of quantity over quality or those things. They're really looking and say, okay, how do I create the best quality marijuana for the best price and make the best use of my employees, and that's kind of the approach that I like to take. Is I like to work specifically with somebody to say, here's where you're at and here's where you could be if that's what you want to do, and look at it that way. So yeah, I think that there is a happy medium, but it's the sort of thing that each grower and each cultivation facility and owner needs to kind of come to an understanding. Where I see oftentimes the problem is just a lack of knowledge, right? They don't know what that next level is. They don't know what the possibility of things could be. And so they're just going to kind of keep doing what they know how to do without the knowledge of, hey, there's other ways of doing this, and there's better ways of doing it. But if they're heads down in the plants on a regular basis and not basically paying attention to the technology and stuff like someone like I am, they may not be aware of it.
How do you figure out what each individual grower's happy medium is? I mean, is it a long conversation about all the sensors that are available on the market, or you kind of just get a feel for their style?
It's really, it's a discussion. I mean, I think that that's a really important part of it. The maturity model helps, but again, it's one of those things of like they answer. So we have an assessment that we're building right now. So there's a big report that's going to kind of go along with doing the assessment. And if they take this self-assessment, we can turn around and give them a report that will give them a roadmap and tell them, hey, this is where we think you're at, and everything else. And of course, that is not going to be 100% accurate for everyone, right? Because people will be at different levels in different places. And so that's why we align it with we have about 14 pillars of what we call, the plant health, right? Plant care health. There's about 14 different pillars around that. And every one of those has a different approach on what you're doing within your organization, how your people do work. And that's also spread across the different levels of the maturity model. So you could score a 1 on your, on basically like your pest and disease management, but you may score a 3 on irrigation, and you may score like a 4 on lighting. So you may have like an amazing lighting system, and that may be the thing you care the most about, right? So it can hit in different places for different cultivators. And then once we kind of have that information, it makes it easier to go back and have a conversation and say, hey, this is where you're at this. Is there anything that you want to look at changing to improve to get better in the process? Now, David, here's the very cool thing about that is that once you've kind of looked at one pillar and you've started some processes, maybe you've put a clinic in place to develop what your pest management process needs to look like. You've trained your people on it. You've got a practice going. You've got a roadmap. You know where you're going. It's much easier now to take that and start applying it to these other pillars, right? So if you find yourself scoring at a 2 at some other area, some other level, maybe it's like nutrients or something like that, then you can say, okay, well, let's apply the same thing here. And it gives you a good kind of roadmap and a dashboard of saying, okay, where are we at? Where can we go? And you can continuously evaluate, like, do we even need to progress, or are we happy here? And I think that's an important part of it is, you're probably fully aware, and, in your audience as well, that, the best path to sort of get from point A to point B is iterative. It's, let's test it. Let's do experiments. Let's see if it works. Let's put it into a production mode. Let's see if it works there. If it continues to work there, then we create an SOP around it. And that's the way we work until we're ready to change that. We're ready to update and move along. And that's, again, not just a technology thing. It goes along with people. It goes along with, even your process of how you move throughout your facility. I've seen people who even analyze that. It's like thinking of it from the industrial standpoint of, like, the fewer touches a plant needs to have, the better it is overall. The fewer people have to be involved, typically the better it is. So a lot of what I kind of bring to the table is, okay, you've been working full steam ahead for a really long time. Let's slow down in some places and let's look at it and analyze it and say, okay, what's the method and the process of improving it to make you even better in this area?
What are the 14 pillars of plant health?
Oh, wow. So let's see if I can, basically go through all of them. So the big ones are obviously temperature, humidity, VPD, carbon dioxide, CO2 management, lighting, air distribution, water, nutrition and fertilization, irrigation and fertigation, which is different than water itself. Water is really about the water quality and how you reuse it, things like that. Growing media, beneficial microorganisms, oxygenation at your root zone. Now, that's one of those ones that's kind of weird because if you're using soil, it doesn't matter as much, but if you're using hydroponics, it's very important. Root zone care, canopy management, and then disease and pest control.
Okay. Nailed it. You ready?
I wasn't cheating and reading off notes, I promise.
Not at all. So how do these 14 plant pillars of health tie into this maturity model to give a cultivator a real good picture of what's going on at their operations?
So again, it kind of fits into that idea of you've got these different stages. Mm-hmm. And so the stages are, you've got what we call ad hoc, basic digitization, intermediate technology adoption, advanced technology adoption, and cutting edge technology adoption. Or if the easy ones are the initial stage, developing stage, define stage, manage stage, and optimizing stage. Now, these aren't things that I necessarily came up with on my own. A lot of this, the idea of a maturity model comes from other industries like, manufacturing, as well as like data management. There's plenty of maturity models around data management. But whenever I went to go look for something like this in cannabis, I was surprised I didn't find anything. There's definitely some things around plant life cycle, without a doubt, right? So there's plenty of information very specific about plant life cycle and plant, care on the different levels of the plant life cycle. So I wanted to avoid that and look at it from the standpoint of, okay, well, plant life cycle is important. Everybody needs to know that, but how do you implement the different stages of? How do you implement germinization? How do you implement managing your veg room, flowering? How do you manage your canopy? And so I didn't find a lot of things that were specific about that, unless you go to one of the Bibles, right? The growing cannabis Bibles, and then you'll find a lot of opinions on, well, this is the way you should do it, and blah blah blah. So that's that was kind of an important step, but building out like the complete maturity model allowed me to do something like look at irrigation and fertigation, like specifically. So that's a good one. And what we do on that is if you go to the ad hoc level, you'll see that we have a whole section that's basically on people and managing. And what it will do is it will talk about the roles involved. Like role involved would be cultivation owner, cultivation manager, growers, cultivation technicians. And then I cover like how do people typically spend their time. And at the ad hoc level, the owner may spend time researching the best practices on irrigation fertigation to make sure that they're making the right kind of decisions. But the cultivation manager, maybe they're basically watering plants, right? So it's kind of that idea. And so we cover that from the people, and then we cover it from like processes and managing. And that's one of those where it's really looking at, lack of standardizations. What does that do? Inefficient resource utilization. What does that do? How does that affect your harvest and your yield? And then I very specifically cover like, if you are at this stage, you should at least be capturing these data attributes, like starting off with some things like, what do you need to gather at this level, and what does it need to look at? And then, all of these things, though, I want to like state that what we do is when we dashboard these things and we actually kind of start looking at numbers around it, we're tying all of these things up to basically like quantity, quality, consistency, and efficiency. So those are kind of the main primary metrics that we're tying things to.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered your question.
It did. It did. One thing that I'm curious about is, so growers seem tech averse right now, or at least on some sort of on the spectrum. Do you foresee as the industry grows, like maybe growers' hands are going to be forced to be a little bit more tech savvy, just, when it comes to efficiencies, stuff like that, stuff that we've seen change traditional manufacturing and other industrial sectors?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to pick on growers just, in particular, because this is common across multiple different types of industries. As a consultant, I've worked with manufacturing, and one of the big fights is always like in manufacturing, you typically have what's called the OT, or the operational technology, right? So that's its own network. And what you'll often find is sometimes there's sort of a guardian of that area, and they're like, no, we don't want to add anything new because I already know how all this stuff works. I don't want to like go in a new direction and try new things. But I think the emphasis for change at this moment is so many states who are seeing issues with like the pricing bottoming out. So pricing really can no longer be a competitive advantage for you as an organization, right? You can't basically say, look, we got the lowest prices, because if you continue, that's that it's like sort of slippery slope down to like, the bottom, right? You're racing towards the bottom if you're competing on price. So if you've gotten by in the past without being able to make better use of your resources, better use of your people, better use of your equipment, you're going to have to do that now, or you'll go out of business. And I hate to be a doomsayer about those kind of things, but it's been shown over and over again that, organizations who are adverse to embracing new technologies and changes in the overall environment of technology and business end up finding themselves becoming Blockbuster, right? Or someone like that. And it can very easily happen to a cannabis grow that is competing with like a multi-state operator of some kind who's at a level 4 on our maturity model, and is able to produce quality and quantity and consistency, and they're able to do it with amazing amount of efficiency, which means like their product is on the store shelves right up there up front, and people ask for it because they recognize it. They're like, this is cookies, I'm going to grab it, because I know what it is, right? And I've often said, like, you may not love Budweiser, but anywhere you go and order a Budweiser, I don't care if you're in Detroit or Japan, that beer is going to taste the same. And there's something to that, right? There's something to that. It may not be the best beer, but at least it tastes, it consistently. And whenever you look at cannabis, what are you kind of looking for? You're looking for something that, like, hey, this this gave me a really good effect. It's the effect that I was looking for. And I'm going to go back to that brand. And if I go back to that brand one or two times and I don't get that same effect, it's different every time. I'm going to look for a brand that's probably going to give me a more consistent, expectation. That if I'm smoking a particular strain, I want it to smoke a particular way and I want it to feel a certain way. And if I go to if I go back to that brand and that doesn't happen, I'm disappointed. I go find somebody else.
Yeah. Your background, you have a lot of experience working within IoT. What is the state of IoT in cannabis, or the cannabis Internet of Things, for lack of a better term?
So it's interesting. The majority of your cannabis IoT systems are really tied to control systems, right?
Mhm.
And so you'll see your big kind of players out there like Trollmaster, right? You've got that as your control system. And what typically happens is that if you're wanting to use sensors or any kind of sensoring technology around that, you're going to need to buy that product and use that. Now, there have been a lot of, I guess, sort of advances lately around IoT specifically for agriculture. And so some of those things I can see moving over into the cannabis space fairly quickly. I'm working with a partner now, and we're talking about using basically, cameras and object detection to be able to look at a large room of plants and at a very small level detect things like mildew and mites and other types of possible pest issues or health issues around the plant. But I think traditionally there's very few IoT folks at the moment who just have like a cannabis specific focus. And that's fine, because again, a moisture sensor is a moisture sensor, a pH sensor is a pH sensor. It doesn't necessarily have to be like have a little marijuana leaf on it to make it special.
Yeah.
But again, I think that one of the big problems with IoT in general, not just for cannabis, is the fact that you have a lot of platforms that basically kind of want to do vendor lock-in, right? You do the platform, you buy the devices for it. It's going to be on a particular protocol. If you even want to get to your data, you may have to pay for it, which I think is ridiculous. But again, there's a lot of sort of devices on the market that if you do it right, if you're basically buying the right kind of device, it's flexible enough that you can do other things with it. And with the advent of this concept that's basically called edge computing, you can actually take your own logic and your own machine learning models and push those down towards a device or a gateway somewhere where you've got more data processing that's even like closer to the plant. So you're not having to necessarily send a lot of telemetry up to the cloud and then do all your processing up there. You can actually do your processing very close to where the plant is and just gather the data that you really need to do other kinds of reporting. And so IoT is like in a very interesting place right now. There's lots of different protocols. So knowing what the right kind of protocol is to use, knowing whether it's going to work inside your facility, because a lot of the facilities that I see, especially indoor grows, are basically big metal warehouses with metal walls between every single grow room. And that can affect your Wi-Fi signals. It can affect your 5G signals. It can affect any radio signal you have could be affected by that. So you may not have like room-to-room communication. So again, I can talk about IoT all day, but that's definitely where we're at. Is cannabis is not necessarily being left behind, but they're definitely seeing some of the same issues and problems that IoT kind of has had in general for a number of years.
How can cannabis in particular overcome those issues? Is it just about trial and error? Is it about, partnering with experts like yourself, just who know what works and what doesn't, just as kind of like a cheat code, for lack of a better term?
Oh, yeah. I think that without a doubt, finding consultants who can basically work directly with you on those things, and especially can come to your location. I think like that's really important, is have someone who knows what they're doing, who can actually go out to your facility and work with you at the facility. Because this isn't a remote work kind of job, right? You're going to need to be there to see, what are the walls like? What are the other possible interferences in the area, especially if you're trying to go wireless with these things. Now, if you're going with a traditional, I'm going to use a control system and it's wired, you may run into the early initial problem that I was talking about. Is like, well, now great, you don't have to worry about wireless or radio signals being a problem, but now you have wires everywhere. And whenever you're trying to basically get to your plants, or you have moving beds or any of these other kind of things, that can basically prohibit working close to your plant. So there's a lot of different trade-offs involved in that, and I'm trying my best to basically kind of constantly stay up to date with where cannabis is in this IoT world, and what are some of the best solutions on it.
How do you stay tech agnostic as you go from facility to facility and, offer the best solution for each operator without being beholden to a supplier or something like that?
Well, so mine is choosing my partners very carefully. So one of my primary partner right now is an organization called Clarify. It's Clarify IO. And they're out of Norway, and they didn't even begin as a cannabis. They're just basically an IoT platform. But I really liked it because it had a lot of collaboration options. And when I looked at it, I thought, okay, this is a kind of thing that I can bring to the table for a lot of different cultivators, and it will meet a lot of different needs, especially whenever I look at my own maturity model and say, okay, where does this fit? It can quickly get somebody across multiple plant pillars from like a level 1 to a level 3 or 4 very fast. So that's one of my kind of deciding factors. But I also am very, I don't want to be beholden to anyone, right? Mm-hmm. So my background is very much in Microsoft and Azure. And I've got certifications in it. It's where I'm basically kind of pro. But I'm not going to go in and say, well, everything is a Microsoft solution, because it's absolutely not. I think some growers are absolutely just fine going with a platform like Clarify IO, or even smaller systems like there's databases like InfluxDB, and you can put Grafana on top of it, and you can run that inside some Docker containers. You can put it on one server. You can put that in your facility, and you can gather metrics in your data there. It's a cheaper, smaller process. It's definitely not going to work for like a bigger cultivation facility, but it's a good solution for where people are at. So that's kind of my litmus test. Is like it's why the assessment is important to me. I like all of my clients who I kind of work with to go through this assessment process. It's a little bit of overhead, but what it does is it allows us to get on the same page of like where they're at. Because I've had people say, hey, I want, to connect up with, this system, and I want to do this and all of these kind of things. And I kind of turn around and say, well, here's your price point. Like, oh no, that's way too much. And it's like, well, where are you at right now? And it's like, well, we have metric. It's like, okay, well, that's a great place to start. I'm glad you're using metric, but there's other things around that are probably going to be more worth your time looking at. And David, one of the things I try and do is avoid big projects. I like to do things small and incremental and test, and then say, okay, is this working for you? And if it's working for you, then we look at like, what's the next step? I know a lot of people may get impatient with that and may think, oh, that's not very fast, and we want to move fast. We want to take the market and blah, blah, blah. But the problem with that is what I've always seen with that is like, well, we have given you an 18-wheeler, a tractor trailer, but you don't have a driver. You don't have any way of paying for the fuel. You don't even know how to do maintenance on a diesel engine. So there's all of those kind of things that I think people don't think about, because let's face it, technology sellers are really good at like saying, look, hey, here's your ROI, and this is all the things that will solve for you. And I'm not saying that all those things aren't true. It's just they sometimes brush over the fact that like, hey, you probably will need staff maybe dedicated to understanding this technology, doing training on this technology. Anytime you bring a new person in, they'll need training on this technology. It's overhead that's involved in it. It just doesn't come in and solve your problems for you.
One of the terms that you threw out that sometimes I think gets bypassed as an industry buzzword is edge computing. So for those in the industry that aren't aware or don't know exactly what edge computing is, could you give us sort of like a 10,000 foot view of it and then talk a little bit about how it specifically fits into cannabis?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So typically in your IoT world, you're using sensors. And sensors can be really simple. It can be a very small thing that's basically like a moisture sensor. And a moisture sensor doesn't take much power, but what it does is just stupidly continuously send the same electronic signals all the time that are interpreted into, a particular level, like a particular level of moisture or something like that. So that's what we call basically like either a leaf device or a dumb device, depending upon, which you want to do it. But so that's your typical devices. Now, edge technology is this ability to take advantage of a MCU, basically a microcontroller unit, or even like a more advanced processor, would typically be inside of your computer, to be able to partner with these kind of sensors. Because traditionally what we would have to do is I'd have to get that sensor data, that moisture sensor, and think about a cultivator that's got 1,000 plants and they're all soil. And I've got a moisture sensor in every single one of these plants. And I've got all this telemetry going up to the cloud every single day so that I can do something with it. Well, what Edge does is it allows me to say, okay, well, at first I am going to go ahead and push all that data up there, but I'm going to build some machine learning models around it that can kind of say, all right, if I'm seeing this level of moisture hit here or here, I want to raise an alert and let one of my facility technicians know that, hey, you're overwatering these plants or underwatering these plants or something like that. So I take that model, and instead of running it in the cloud to send them alerts, I move it down to an edge device, because now that model can basically run in my facility near my plants and make decisions in real time. And so instead of needing to send all that data up to the cloud, I can just collect it there. And what I might then do is then on the edge device, I may just create aggregates of that data. Right. I may just say, hey, here's moisture levels for the past hour. And then I'm going to send that aggregate up to the cloud so I can do reporting on it there still. But I've saved myself on the cost of sending telemetry up to the cloud, and then storing all that telemetry on the cloud. Right. So it has some cost benefits. And whenever it comes to things like another thing that is a good point is your security systems or your internal cameras. They're basically looking inside your cultivation facility. You may want to protect everyone's, personal identification or information there, right? So storing that type data, on-prem and not sending it up to the cloud gives you the opportunity to kind of go through and blur out people's faces if needed or something like that. So those are kind of some of the many use cases for doing edge technology. But the best way to think about it is that I'm literally taking some of the power and analytics capability that I would have in a cloud system like, AWS or Azure, and I'm moving it closer to the device and closer to the plant itself so that I can make those kind of decisions, in a faster time period, and have them there on my facility and close to me.
One thing that I hear is that edge computing and IoT always sound great, but they also sound expensive. So is it possible to do this on a budget, or is it just you're all in?
I think that it's possible to do it on a budget. And by that, I mean starting off on kind of a small proof of concept within your facility to see. And I encourage cultivators to prove out that the solution, I mean, it's on me and it's on them, like a joint relationship when we go to like do one of these things, to say, let's prove out that it's actually helping you, that it's actually useful. And it's better to do that on a smaller scale. And you definitely can do it on a smaller scale. There's a number of, again, like Clarify IO, I'll point out to that. Like, it's very easy to get that stood up quickly. It's easy for me to get a couple of devices on there to start basically looking at those areas of plant pillar. And then, easy to go up there and start looking at it and communicating with a team. I think, again, I'll kind of point back to one of the big failings from technology to our customers is often this idea that, oh no, you need to go all in. Like, this needs to be, it's going to be a big project. It's going to take 6 months. You're going to have to spend $250,000 a month, something like that. And I don't think that that's always necessary. It might be after we've done a POC and you've got 5 cultivation facilities and you say, heck yeah, this works for me. But then at least you have, you've come to this as a cultivator, you're the one who has come to the decision based upon data that you're seeing on a daily basis, based upon your own instincts and all those things. I don't have to sell you on it. Like it's you're selling yourself on it because you're seeing the results of it. But yes, I'll answer your question. Edge technology, IoT, all of these things, they are indeed an expensive investment. They're not cheap. They're not cheap from a financial standpoint, and they're not necessarily cheap from a time standpoint. And by time, I mean, there is always going to be an initial investment in training and setup, in just learning, as a team. But once you get past that, it almost becomes invisible. It's like, okay, this is a helping hand that we've got in the background, and I can use this now to like send me alerts and reports and those things. So there's kind of a big upfront investment, so that maybe the next maybe this harvest or the next harvest are going to be really focused on learning and understanding what we've got there. But hopefully that makes harvest number 3 easy, and then harvest number 4 we don't even remember we have an IoT system. It's like that, it's that simple.
Has it ever not proven out?
Oh yeah. It can. Now, not in, so I would like to say not in my particular experience with cannabis, but I've seen it not prove out in other organizations. And I have to say that the majority of the time it's because they bit off more than they could chew. They did that all or nothing. We're going to go in it. We're going to build these things out without even a real understanding. And this is one of those where you start kind of blaming the consultant, like not understanding the elements of like communication and protocol. How are these devices going to talk to a gateway? How is this gateway going to talk to the cloud? And not walking through that process. I would say that most projects fail in the IoT spectrum because people rush in and try and do it fast, and they do it without the conversations that are necessary to kind of really understand, well, what are your needs for IoT? And again, is IoT going to help you improve your quality? Is it going to increase quantity? Is it going to help with your efficiency? Is it going to get you a consistent product? And so all of those questions around those things need to be answered whenever you're looking at bringing in any kind of new technology. Is it going to help with the bottom line on one of those metrics? And if the answer is, well, yes, then it's definitely like worth looking at and pursuing. But I'm not sure how many people answer those questions. And I've seen a lot of shiny object syndrome, right? Where it's like, oh, it's a new cool thing. Let's do it. Let's buy it. Let's put it in here. And it's like, without taking into consideration all the expenses that are around it, the training and that part of it.
Okay. Well, understanding that IoT is pretty nascent in cannabis right now, what does the prospect of AI integration hold in the cannabis industry? I mean, we see that it's being very disruptive in many places right now. What does the future landscape look of like AI's role in cannabis cultivation and operations in general?
Well, I can definitely tell you that it can help with things like recognizing the health of the plant. So I'm already working with a partner who's got basically a product that's their focus, right? Is like, hey, let's look at the health of the plant. Let's do it with object recognition. So that's a good place to start. But if we look at like generative AI, like Chat GPT, like, how can I use that? Well, if you think about SOPs, and every cultivation facility almost has, some are required to have, SOPs by law. Well, I don't know about you, but documentation is a pain in the neck. Like nobody wants to write documentation. Nobody wants to update documentation. So what if you had a bot do that for you, right? So what if you had a bot that could basically, you could go to that had all of the information about your cultivation facility in particular, and you could chat with it, and you could basically say, hey, we're thinking about running AK-47 on this next harvest. We've done it before. Tell me what my data is around that and what we did and what our process was, and then have Chat GPT basically, spit out, a report that says, hey, this is what you did last time, here's your data around it. This is what you need to basically look at for nutrients. And then you can basically say, okay, I like that, build an SOP around it and hand that out to all my technicians, make sure that they know that, hey, this is kind of the process we're going to follow. So I think where you're going to see it helping is the same place it's going to help a lot of other organizations, any place where you've had to do a lot of manual typing of creating content and things internally, it's going to help, in that area. Now, again, it's not going to do our jobs for us. As I've often said, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, AI is going to replace people's jobs and things like that." It's like, no, AI is not going to replace people's jobs. Someone who knows AI and uses it well is going to replace your job. And that's kind of the trick to it, is where do we find places that are going to be able to help cultivators here? Again, it's that whole concept of how can I take away that burden of all the technology and administration and some of those things that cultivators have to do, so they can spend more time with the plants. I've looked a little bit about this concept around, smart rooms, right? So this is basically an intelligent grow room, and you can talk to it and you say, hey, what's the state of my grow room at this moment? Well, the temperature's here. I'm seeing a microclimate over here that could be a problem because fungus tends to grow whenever the microclimate looks like that. We just did a watering, we just did nutrition. This is the state of the plants. Like that kind of concept, I think, is a little bit science fiction at the moment for most cultivators, but I don't think it's not outside the realm of capability, right? It would be expensive, but it's definitely a thing that you could do today, right? It's not a future thing. I think it's a future thing mainly because of, like, is it worth the cost to build something like that? And I think with most technology, that's a thing you have to look at. I've seen some really cool stuff where people basically are using augmented reality to put on a headset and walk into a grow room and be able to see, like, infrared predator-like visions of the plants, right? And that sounds amazing and cool, but who's got, $5,000, who's got, what's the new Apple? Who's got $3,800 for every one of your, right, to give to every one of your, technicians to be able to go in and do stuff? And what's the real added benefit of that versus, going around with a temperature sensor maybe and checking to see, hey, what's my microclimates look like, or putting the right kind of instrumentation in place that's looking for microclimates. So which is why it's a good idea to have a discussion about these things from someone who's a little bit more neutral than, say, a vendor. And nothing against vendors, love them. But there's not very many vendors who are like, oh no, you don't need our solution.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. At the end of the day, the vendor
out
doesn't
there, but
exist.
they're rare. Yeah.
They don't exist if they don't vend what they have for sale.
Exactly.
Yeah. But doesn't stand to reason that I recently saw this really interesting demonstration of AI in agriculture where, once everything is kind of built in, and I know that it's expensive, but you think of this IoT infrastructure that we're already putting into these grow rooms where AI could basically understand everything about the room and then at least make recommendations as to what needs to be harvested, what should be planted next, where levels need to change. It kind of blew my mind as to how it could make a room smarter, but I don't, kind of to your point about growers being averse to technology, I don't know if, if that would be embraced as much.
Well, and I think the key to that is, I think it would be, but what it's going to have to do is use your growers' knowledge. And I think like that's where some of these things kind of miss the mark. And you could even argue that my maturity model would miss the mark with that, because I didn't go to 25 different growers and kind of say, hey, what's the best way of doing these things and these other things? I'm going off of some very general knowledge about cultivation processes. I've gone to like some specific books and, information about that. But, I'm sure that there's probably a grower out there who can look at my maturity model and look at something and go, no, sir, nope, that's not the way you do it. And because there's multiple paths up the mountain, right? There's multiple ways of doing things. I can talk to one grower. As a matter of fact, I just talked to a grower recently, and he was like, hydroponics is it. Like, it is the only way to do this thing. Like, if you're not doing hydroponics, you're a noob. And, and then I work with a cultivator who's like, man, soil is the only way to do it. Soil is Mother Nature's gift, and there's no reason to get away from it. So the trick to that is the AI needs to be able to adapt to the ideology of the grower, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it needs to know that, hey, this is the way my grower likes to work. They prefer to use, cocoa as their grow medium, and so we need to take into consideration things around cocoa, like it will absorb your nutrients. Like the AI needs to kind of understand those things. So whenever it's making those recommendations, it's making them off of knowledge that is specific to that grow facility. Now, I think we are at a very cool place right now because now, most of us are probably familiar with like OpenAI and ChatGPT, and you can log on. But the understanding there is that that's one big model that actually a whole lot of people are sharing. We are at the point now where you can get that same type of model and you can run it in your local facility, and you can run it on your data. So but the trick there, and this is one of the reasons why I created the maturity model, most people don't have the data. Most people aren't collecting the data necessary to feed to a model like that so it can help make, smart decisions about what are the next steps and what should our next harvest look like. So a lot of what I want to do is help growers get in this position to where at least they're starting on that roadmap to be able to get AI. So you may not have a model like, day one, but if that's a goal, if you want to get to that point, then we have to start collecting the right kind of data specifically to your plants and specifically to your environment and to your people. We need to have that collected somewhere, and we need to be able to, make smart decisions off that data, and then eventually use that data to train a model so it can start taking over some of those, I would say, mundane tasks and steps, and help with the forecasting. I think forecasting is, again, one of the reasons why I've got my ad hoc level is because I've met a lot, it's like, dude, the only thing I care about is the harvest that I have going right now. I've got these things in my veg room. I've got these things in flower. I know that I've got X number of orders that are expected to be fulfilled by, all these dispensaries, and I got to get stuff, cured. I got to get it, trimmed. I got to get it packaged. That's it. And it's just, that's a loop. There's never a point where you stop and kind of go, where am I? Where's my business? Am I growing the right thing? Am I really like, can I look at sales numbers from, data that's coming in from my dispensaries, my partners who I'm working with out there, and see, hey, how is my product selling? And am I making decisions on that? I don't know how many cultivators, are. Now, I'm sure that there are some, because there's plenty of people who are at that level 2, level 3, and level 4 maturity levels. But I'm pretty certain that there's plenty out there that are just like, man, I wake up, I got my coffee, what am I doing today? And that's how they run their business. And you know, it's totally understandable. Not trying to be judgmental, but if you're running your business that way, you're missing out on a lot of opportunity. And I think that's the way I kind of look at it. It's like you're missing out on opportunity to be able to put better product into your customer hands in a more timely manner, to meet the expectations that they're looking for, because you're really not thinking ahead. You're not thinking of like harvest number 6. You're just thinking of harvest number 1.
Is there someone out there right now that's like halfway to harvest 6? I mean, a lot of these industries are all follower industries, right? Where as soon as there's the one that hits it, then everyone's like, okay, we got to get into this in a big way right now. Is somebody almost there?
So no one I'm specifically working with, but there's definitely some folks in Canada who I would say are close, are there or close to being there, and California. There's a few there. It's I'm trying to remember some specific names of some facilities that I would say, yeah, those guys are there. In Canada, there's a facility in Canada for sure comes to mind. It's huge. It's one of these giant, you look at it and you think, what do they do? Build airplanes there? It's that kind of place. And yeah, they are to the point that, they have their closed off rooms, and there's mostly like robotic systems that are, working through that room to look through, look at their plants, and all of their watering is automated. Their lighting is automated. And you may have growers that go in, but when they go in, they basically dress up in bunny suits, and they're fully, they go through a decontamination process. And so they are there, but they're they typically, like in the States, are going to be one of these multi-state operators or one of the larger, facilities that are in Canada. Now my market, which is primarily Oklahoma, I don't know of anybody who's even close to to that.
Okay. Is it possible? And again, I'm kind of curious just where we're at in it. I think it was Beck's recently did a whole campaign around AI, right? Where the AI had the recipe for the beer and pretty much everything other than the physical manufacturing of the beer. Everything else was AI generated from the recipe all the way through the marketing of the actual product. Does that exist in cannabis? And how close are we to that? Like an actual AI generated cultivar?
Well, and see, I would even question Beck's, like how much of that is actually fully AI automated and not humanly, there's not a little bit of a human element involved in the process of tweaking the data and tweaking the prompts and tweaking yeah, exactly, the elements along the path to get there. So my skepticism kicks in because I work in this field and I know how these models work, to say that, oh, it did it all on its own, all the way from like one end to the other. I'd want to see the data on that, right? But are we there yet for, cannabis? I honestly don't know. And one of the areas that interests me lately that I've been trying to get a little bit more into is the tissue culture game. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of like, instead of basically growing a mom and cutting a branch off and cloning from that I'm now getting into using tissue culture. And I have read some reports where people are using CRISPR, which is your genetic, workshop, right, to kind of go in and do genetic modifications of plants. A lot of it, though, is really strange. It's like, hey, let's get THC out of this plant and let's put it in like a different plant, which I think you're going to find. I think you're going to run into like some of the problems of, we don't fully understand everything about the cannabis plant yet. Mm-hmm. It is a thing that we are still in the process of learning more about. There's a lot of like what I would call tribal knowledge, right? And this is what's been passed down from our wonderful black market growers who've been growing for the past, 40 or 50 years, that tell us, like, they inform us today on like what we can do with particular strains and recipes and things like that. And I think this is invaluable information, but because it has been a prohibited, item for so long, there's just not enough scientific research around cannabis at this point, I think, to be able to go and say, all right, let's use AI to genetically engineer a new plant, or, maybe even suggest strains. Now that might be a possibility. You may very easily be able to go in and say, hey, I've got this strain here and this strain here. Let's combine them together. And what do you think the outcomes are going to be? Now, again, generative models, and this is the nature of generative models, is that, just to be frank, they make shit up. That's what they're doing. They're generative. They're not necessarily thinking things through cognitively and rationally the way humans do. Not yet, anyway. I see there's going to be a point where we will have a collection of different types of models, and the generative part may rely on the rational part to work together. But right now, when you're looking at something like ChatGPT, it's a generative model. Now, granted, it's like a human who has basically been reading books for 1,000,000 years. So it knows a lot, and it's able to use that information to do things with it. But when you go and you ask it to do creative things, which it can do, your outcomes from it are not necessarily something that I would like basically bet the house on. So I might be able to go to something and say, hey, here's this strain, here's the genetic profile of this strain, here's this other strain, genetic profile of the strain, combine these things together and tell me what I'll see. Unless it really has a vast knowledge of genetics and specifically cannabis, I think you're not going to get a great result from that yet. And that's just today. Specifically, a year from now, someone may be looking at this, podcast and be like, that dude was totally wrong because we're doing that today. It's very possible.
How often, because you're so close to it, how often do you see people use AI in marketing and you're just like, I don't know.
All the time. Yeah, people are using AI in marketing all the time. And I think who's latching onto it are your very small organizations. And, I do myself, like, I've got Instagram. I use Midjourney for creating the majority of my imagery and things like that, for it. So it's, and of course, I use it for generating content and other types of things. The really good ones, the really good people who know how to do this, you won't know. You won't know the difference. You'll think that this was basically human created, because deep down inside, I mean, it's not like I can just go push a button and it does all the work for me. I do have to contribute quite a bit to the process that the AI model is going through to generate stuff. What it does do for me is it basically saves me time of having to type out word per word and then go back and do editing and reviewing and those things. I can generally kind of jump in and create something fairly quickly and get it ready for production. So it's kind of again, like it's a tool. And that's the thing. It's important for people to understand. And like any tool, if you try and put in a screw with a hammer, it can be done, but is it the right way to do it? Like, you have to understand like the tools and things are around it to be able to make the best use of it. So yeah, definitely, I see a lot of AI going into marketing, especially in imagery and in text and in that area. And it's going to continue. That's going to be further down. You're going to continue to see that.
Well, Shawn, thank you very much for taking the time. Honestly, it's kind of blown my mind a little bit. But before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows about yourself or Green Nanny?
Sure. Yeah. So if I can, I'd like to pitch my Grower in the Loop website. So, because that's the place right now where if you are interested in learning more about, the maturity model and you're interested in saying, hey, how do I make the next steps in my technology? Or even like, look, I don't know anything about technology and I just need somebody who I can like bounce some ideas off of. If you go to growerintheloop.com, it's like one word. There's an email sign up. And if you sign up on there, then you'll get my initial little instructions on, what the Grower in the Loop process is and how the assessments work and some of those things. Just basically 3 emails you'll get. But then I kind of send out some newsletters occasionally saying, hey, this is where I'm at in the process and this is what I'm working on. And additionally, starting in, very soon, I'm going to be working fractional CTO with Papa Jesus Farms. So you may see a little bit more of me popping up into Papa Jesus Farms, Instagram and, communication around that as we kind of take Clint's facilities there and start building those out and, testing automation. And, Clint's a great guy. He's like, yeah, let's test it. Let's see. Let's, we're set, as long as it doesn't damage my plants or hurt a harvest, we can go for it. And so I'm looking personally, I'm looking for cultivators, that are like that are like, hey, look, I'm interested in doing more with my technology than what I'm presently doing. I'm not a big facility. I'm not a giant facility. I'm just, a small group. I fit my pricing and things so that it matches with that customer segment.
Excellent. Well, Shawn, thank you again for taking the time. And I hope we get a chance to do it again soon, especially after it's Papa Jesus Farms that you're going to be working on.
That's it. Yes.
Yeah. After you start working there, man, let's have you back. I want to see how everything's going.
Okay. That'd be awesome. David, I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
All right. Well, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at David@Cannabis Equipment News with email the podcast in the subject line. Please subscribe to our daily newsletter to make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. For Shawn Deggans, owner of Green Nanny, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.